I let it in. We all share a fundamental, unspoken belief in the power of a locked door. It is the invisible boundary line between the chaos of the outside world and the sacred, untouchable sanctuary of our homes. When you turn that deadbolt at night, you hear that heavy metallic click, and your brain releases a tiny dose of dopamine. You are safe. The monsters cannot cross the threshold. But what if the lock isn't designed to keep the monsters out? What if the lock is just a test? A test to see how easily your empathy can be weaponized against you. Because the most dangerous things in the dark don't shatter your windows. They don't kick down your doors. They simply knock and wait for you to make the biggest mistake of your life. Lock your doors, draw the blinds, and turn the volume up. Welcome to American Haunted Tales. My name is David, and I live at the end of a long, winding cul-de-sac in the heavily wooded suburbs of the Pacific Northwest. If you've never spent a winter in Washington State, you don't know what real rain is. It isn't a passing shower. It is a relentless, suffocating deluge that can last for weeks, turning the dense pine forests into a dark, sinking swamp. My house is an older, split-level build, backed directly up against miles of state-owned conservation land. I bought it because I wanted the privacy. I wanted the quiet. I work as a freelance archivist, digitizing old county records, which means I spend 90% of my life in my home office, staring at a glowing monitor. It was the second week of November, and we were in the middle of a massive atmospheric river. The local news had been broadcasting flash flood warnings for 3 days straight. The wind was violently whipping the tops of the massive Douglas firs in my backyard, and the rain was hammering against my roof with the deafening roar of a jet engine. It was 1:15 a.m. I was sitting in my living room, the only light coming from the muted television screen and a small reading lamp beside my armchair. I was exhausted, nursing a lukewarm mug of tea, just waiting for the storm to lull so I could fall asleep. And then, I heard it. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't a branch hitting the roof. It wasn't the wind rattling the siding. It was a heavy, deliberate, frantic knocking coming from my solid steel front door. I froze, the mug of tea halfway to my mouth. My house is at the very end of a dead-end street. I have no immediate neighbors. To get to my front porch, you have to walk up a steep, 60-foot asphalt driveway in the pitch black, surrounded by dense, aggressive woods. Nobody comes to my house by accident, and nobody comes at 1:15 in the morning during a torrential flood, unless something is terribly, terribly wrong. Thump, thump, thump. The knocking grew faster, more desperate. It sounded like someone slamming the side of their fist against the metal, lacking the coordination to use their knuckles. I set my mug down on the coaster. My hands were shaking. I walked slowly into the front entryway, the hardwood floor cold against my bare feet. I didn't turn on the porch light. I didn't want whoever was out there to know exactly where I was standing. I crept up to the heavy door and pressed my eye against the small, circular glass of the peephole. The fisheye lens distorted the world outside, bending the dark porch into a curved, watery nightmare. The rain was coming down in sheets, illuminated only by the faint, ambient glow of a street lamp 50 yards down the road. Standing on my welcome mat was a woman. She looked to be in her late 20s. She was drenched, her blonde hair plastered flat to her skull, dripping dark water onto the collar of her thin, gray trench coat. She wasn't looking at the door. She was looking frantically over her shoulder, her eyes wide, staring out into the pitch-black void of my wooded driveway. "Please," she sobbed, her voice muffled but audible through the heavy steel door. "Please, God, is someone in there? Please open the door." She slammed her open palms against the metal. I stepped back, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every survival instinct I had honed from watching true crime documentaries was screaming at me. It's a trap. It's a setup. There are two men waiting with crowbars just out of sight. You open that door and you're dead. Please, she shrieked, her voice cracking in pure, unadulterated terror. He's coming. He's right behind me. Please let me in. I leaned back into the peephole. She was pressing her face almost directly against the steel, her makeup running in dark, jagged rivers down her pale cheeks. She looked absolutely, genuinely terrified. She kept looking back at the tree line, physically recoiling as if she could see something moving in the dark pines. My mind raced. I reached for my cell phone in my pocket to call 911, but the screen displayed no service. The atmospheric river had knocked out the cell towers in the valley hours ago. I couldn't call the police. I couldn't call for help. I was the only lifeline this woman had. Who is coming? I yelled through the door, my voice trembling. Who is out there? She jumped, startling at the sound of my voice. She pressed her hands flat against the door, leaning her forehead against the cold steel. I don't know, she sobbed, her breath hitching wildly. My car went off the road, a mile back. I was walking, and something started following me from the woods. It isn't an animal. Please, I can hear it in the trees. It's so fast. You have to let me in before it sees the porch. I stared at her through the distorted glass. She was shivering violently, her lips a faint shade of blue. If she was acting, she deserved an Academy Award. I looked past her, straining to see into the dark, curved edges of the peephole's view. I couldn't see anything but the torrential rain and the swaying branches of the massive fir trees. But I knew the woods. I knew how dark they were. I knew how easy it was for something to hide just a few feet away from the edge of the light. Snap! I heard it clearly, even over the deafening roar of the rain. A massive, heavy branch snapping in the woods bordering my driveway. The woman shrieked, a raw, guttural sound of pure panic, and flattened herself entirely against my front door, trying to make herself as small as possible. Please, she begged, her voice dropping to a frantic, hyperventilating whisper. He's here. I can hear him breathing. Open the door. I beg you. I am not a hero. I am a quiet archivist who lives alone. But I am also a human being. I couldn't stand on the warm, dry side of a steel door and listen to a woman get dragged into the woods to be murdered. The guilt would shatter my mind. I made my decision. I grabbed the heavy brass handle of the deadbolt. I'm opening it, I yelled. The second I open it, you get inside, understand? Yes, thank you, she cried, pressing her hands against the doorframe, ready to push inward. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for whatever was going to happen next. I turned the deadbolt. The heavy metallic clack echoed loudly in the small entryway. I grabbed the handle, pushed down, and pulled the heavy steel door open. The freezing wind and rain instantly blasted into my house, soaking the front of my shirt and bringing with it the sharp, metallic smell of wet asphalt and rotting pine needles. The woman didn't hesitate. She threw herself through the threshold, stumbling into my entryway and collapsing onto the hardwood floor, gasping for air. I didn't look outside. I didn't try to see what had been chasing her. I slammed the heavy steel door shut with all my weight, drove the deadbolt home, and slid the thick brass chain into its slot. I leaned against the door, chest heaving, listening. Nothing hit the door. Nobody slammed against the wood. The only sound was the howling wind and the torrential rain outside. I let out a massive, shaky exhale and looked down at the woman. She was sitting on my floor, her knees pulled tight to her chest, her head buried in her arms, shivering uncontrollably. A massive puddle of dark rainwater was pooling around her on the hardwood. Are you okay?" I asked, my voice much softer now. "You're safe. The door is locked. Whatever was out there can't get in." She didn't look up immediately. She took a long, slow, deep breath, her shivering beginning to subside. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice muffled by her wet coat. "Let me get you a towel," I said, stepping away from the door. "My landline is dead, and I don't have cell service, but you can stay here until the storm passes, and then I'll drive you into town." "You don't need to do that," she said. Her voice had changed. It wasn't a subtle shift. The frantic, hyperventilating, terrified pitch was entirely gone. It was replaced by a smooth, calm, incredibly flat tone that sent a spike of ice directly into my spinal cord. I stopped halfway to the hallway closet. I slowly turned around to look at her. She was still sitting on the floor, but her head was raised. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking around my house. She was taking in the vaulted ceilings, the dark hallway leading to the bedrooms, the locked windows. And then she slowly pushed herself up off the floor. Her movements were entirely too fluid. She didn't use her hands to brace herself. She just glided upward, her joints silent. She stood in my entryway, water dripping from her hair, and finally turned her eyes to meet mine. They weren't the eyes of a terrified woman. Her irises were completely, unnaturally black. They absorbed the dim light of the living room like a void. The panic and the tears had vanished without a trace, leaving behind an expression of terrifying, predatory amusement. She looked at the heavy steel door behind her. She looked at the engaged deadbolt. She looked at the thick brass chain. A slow, wide, unnatural smile stretched across her face, pulling the skin of her cheeks far too tight. "Good," she whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the quiet house. "You locked it." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "Good, you locked it." My brain simply stopped processing reality. It hit a hard, insurmountable wall. For 30 seconds, neither of us moved. The only sounds in the house were the violent hammering of the rain against the living room windows and the steady, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of dark rainwater falling from her trench coat onto my pristine hardwood floor. "What did you say?" I whispered. My voice didn't sound like my own. It sounded hollow, scraped thin by a sudden paralyzing surge of adrenaline. She didn't answer me. Instead, she took a single, slow step forward. Her movements were entirely wrong. When a human being walks, there is a natural shifting of weight, a slight bobbing of the shoulders, a bending of the knees. She didn't walk. She glided. It looked as though she was being pulled forward by an invisible tether attached to her chest, her feet barely brushing the floorboards. I took a frantic step backward, my heel catching the edge of the hallway rug. I stumbled, barely keeping my balance. "Get out!" I stammered, raising my hands in a pathetic defensive gesture. "I opened the door to help you. Now I want you to leave. Turn around and unlock the door." She tilted her head to the side. The angle was too sharp. I heard the sickening, wet pop of her cervical vertebrae separating, a sound so loud it echoed over the storm outside. Her solid black eyes never left mine. There was no white sclera, no iris, just two bottomless voids of absolute consuming darkness. "But David," she said, her voice smooth, melodic, and completely devoid of human empathy. "It's raining so hard outside, and it's so warm in here." She knew my name. I hadn't introduced myself. I hadn't spoken a single identifying word to her through the door. How do you know my name? I backed up another step, my shoulder hitting the wall of the hallway. She smiled again, that terrible wide stretching of pale skin. We know exactly who lives at the end of the road, David. We know you live alone. We know you work in the room at the end of the hall. We've been watching you through the glass for a very, very long time. But we have rules. We can't cross the boundary, not unless we are invited. Not unless the master of the house opens the door with his own 2 hands. A wave of pure, freezing terror washed over me, numbing my fingers and toes. The true crime documentaries, the logic, the rational fear of home invaders, none of it applied here. I hadn't let a serial killer into my house. I had let in something much, much older. And then, the lights went out. The power grid, battered by 3 days of the atmospheric river, finally failed. The living room plunged into total, absolute blackness. No, I gasped in the dark. I didn't wait for my eyes to adjust. I knew the layout of my house by heart. I spun around and sprinted down the hallway toward the kitchen. I needed a weapon. I needed a heavy chef's knife from the butcher block, and I needed to get out the back door. As I ran, I heard her laughing behind me. It wasn't the frantic, terrified sobbing from the front porch. It was a soft, airy, delighted giggle that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. It was the sound of a predator enjoying the first few seconds of the hunt. I hit the kitchen, my bare feet slipping slightly on the linoleum. I threw my hands out in the pitch black, feeling for the edge of the granite counter. My fingers brushed the cold stone, and I followed it rapidly to the heavy wooden butcher block. I gripped the thick, rubberized handle of the largest knife I had, pulling it free with a sharp, metallic shk. I backed up against the kitchen island, gripping the knife with both hands, straining my eyes in the dark. The only illumination came from the sporadic, faint flashes of lightning outside, me filtering weakly through the rain-streaked kitchen window. The house was dead silent inside. I couldn't hear her footsteps. I couldn't hear the dripping of her wet coat. "Where are you?" I yelled, my voice cracking wildly in the dark. "I have a knife. I'll use it." "I know you will, David," her voice whispered. It didn't come from the hallway. It came from directly above me. I swung the knife upward blindly, letting out a raw, guttural scream of pure panic. The heavy steel blade sliced through empty air. I stumbled backward, tripping over one of the tall wooden bar stools, crashing hard onto the kitchen floor. A flash of lightning illuminated the kitchen for a fraction of a second. She was clinging to the ceiling. Her long, pale limbs were splayed out like a massive gray spider. Her fingers and toes pressed flat against the drywall. Her head was twisted completely backward on her neck, staring down at me with those bottomless black eyes, that terrifying, wide smile stretching almost ear to ear. The kitchen plunged back into darkness before I could even process the impossible geometry of her body. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, the knife abandoned on the floor. I didn't care about a weapon anymore. A knife wasn't going to stop something that defied gravity. I needed to get out. I hit the sliding glass door leading to the back patio. I reached up, grabbed the heavy plastic handle, and yanked it sideways. It didn't budge. I pulled again, harder, my muscles straining. I fumbled for the locking latch, sliding it up and down frantically. The lock was disengaged, but the door was entirely jammed in its track. It felt as though it had been welded shut from the outside. "You can't leave, David," her voice echoed, this time coming from the dark corner of the kitchen near the refrigerator. She was back on the floor. I could hear the wet, heavy squelch of her soaked shoes stepping onto the linoleum. "You locked the front door. You threw the deadbolt. You slid the chain. You sealed the tomb." She was playing with me. She was feeding on the absolute frantic terror radiating from my pores. I abandoned the sliding glass door and bolted back toward the hallway. My only chance was the front door. If I could reach the entryway, undo the locks I had just thrown, and throw myself out into the storm, I might have a chance. I would run down the driveway in the pitch black until I hit the main road. I ran blindly through the dark, my shoulder clipping the edge of the hallway wall. I ignored the pain, sprinting into the front entryway. The faint, ambient glow of the street lamp outside filtered through the small, circular peephole of the heavy steel door. It was my beacon. I slammed my body against the door, my hands frantically reaching for the thick brass chain. I slid it out of its track. It fell against the doorframe with a loud clack. I grabbed the heavy deadbolt, my sweaty fingers slipping against the cold metal. I forced it to turn, the internal mechanism disengaging with a heavy thud. I grabbed the handle and pushed down. A cold, wet, impossibly strong hand clamped over my wrist. The temperature of her skin was freezing. It felt like grabbing a block of dry ice. The cold burned instantly, and shooting a spike of agonizing pain up my forearm. I screamed, trying to yank my arm away, but her grip was like a steel vise. She was standing right beside me in the dark entryway. I hadn't heard her move. I hadn't heard her cross the living room. "Why are you trying to leave your own house, David?" she whispered, her face inches from mine. I could smell the stagnant, swampy odor of the woods on her breath. "It's cold out there. There are monsters in the woods. Don't you remember? You let me in to protect me from them." With a sudden, violent jerk, she threw me backward. I flew through the air, crashing hard against the opposite wall of the entryway, the breath knocked entirely out of my lungs. I slid down the drywall, gasping for air, clutching my freezing, bruised wrist. She stood in front of the door, her dark silhouette blocking the only exit. "You see, David," she said smoothly, slowly pacing back and forth in front of the door. "The stories you humans tell are so incredibly flawed. You think a locked door keeps you safe? You think that if you hide in your little boxes of wood and drywall, the dark can't touch you. But the lock isn't a shield." She stopped pacing and looked down at me, her black eyes absorbing the faint light. "The lock is a contract. You invited me inside, you crossed the threshold, and you sealed us in together. You didn't lock me out. You locked yourself in with me." I pushed myself up against the wall, my legs trembling so badly they could barely support my weight. "What are you?" I choked out, a line of blood running down my chin from where I had bitten my tongue. "I am the consequence of your empathy," she smiled. "I am the thing that knocks in the dark." She raised her hand toward my face, her elongated fingers reaching out to touch my cheek. I didn't think. I reacted with pure, blind desperation. I lunged forward, not at her, but diving low toward her legs. I tackled her at the knees, throwing all my remaining weight forward. She didn't expect the physical assault. She stumbled backward, her wet shoes slipping on the hardwood floor. I scrambled over her, scrambling frantically toward the door. I grabbed the heavy brass handle, shoved it down, and threw the heavy steel door open. The storm hit me instantly. The deafening roar of the rain, the howling wind, the freezing cold. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever felt. I threw myself out of the house. I'm rolling across the wet concrete of the front porch. I didn't stop to look back. I scrambled to my feet and ran down the steep 60-foot asphalt driveway, slipping and sliding in the pitch black, the rain blinding me. I ran until my lungs burned, until I reached the very end of the cul-de-sac, where the lone streetlight cast a pale, orange circle of illumination onto the flooded road. I collapsed onto my knees on the wet asphalt, gasping, choking on rainwater, shivering violently in the freezing storm. I had made it. I was out. I had escaped. I slowly turned around, looking back up the long, dark driveway toward my house. The heavy steel front door was wide open, swinging gently in the wind. The house was completely dark. I waited for her to come running down the driveway after me. I waited for those long, pale limbs to come scrambling out of the dark pines. But nothing came. The woods were silent, save for the storm. I stood up, wrapping my arms around myself, shivering so hard my teeth clacked together. I was standing in a torrential downpour in a thin t-shirt and pajama pants. The temperature was dropping rapidly. Hypothermia would set in within 20 minutes. I looked at my house, my safe, warm, dry sanctuary at the top of the hill. And then a light flickered on inside. The power hadn't come back on. It was a single, warm, orange glow originating from the living room, the glow of the fireplace. Someone had lit a fire. I stared up at the large picture window facing the front yard. Standing in the window, illuminated perfectly by the warm firelight behind her, was the woman. She had taken off the wet trench coat while she was holding my mug of tea. She looked down the driveway, directly at me standing in the freezing rain under the streetlight. She raised her free hand and gave me a slow, mocking wave. Then she turned around, walked over to the heavy steel front door, and pulled it shut. I heard the heavy, metallic clack of the deadbolt engaging, echoing all the way down the driveway. I stood there in the freezing rain, the realization of what had just happened crashing over me with the force of a physical blow. She didn't want to kill me. She didn't want to drag me into the dark. She wanted my house. She was a creature of the freezing, wet, miserable woods, and she had needed an invitation to take the only warm sanctuary for miles. By locking the door behind her, I hadn't just trapped myself. I had officially surrendered the space. I had given her the keys to the castle. I turned away from my own home, the cold seeping deep into my bones. The closest neighbor was 2 miles down the winding, heavily wooded road. 2 miles in a torrential flood, in freezing temperatures, with no shoes and no coat. I began to walk. The wind howled, whipping the rain against my face like tiny needles. The dark pines loomed on either side of the road, hiding whatever other nightmares lived in the deep woods. I reached the first house 30 minutes later. I was entirely numb. I couldn't feel my fingers or my toes. My lips were cracked and bleeding. I stumbled up the long driveway, dragging my feet onto the wooden front porch. The house was completely dark. The owners were fast asleep, safe and warm in their beds. I leaned against the heavy wooden front door, my legs giving out beneath me. I raised a frozen, trembling fist and began to knock on the wood. Thump, thump, thump. Please, I sobbed, my voice cracking, staring frantically over my shoulder into the dark, swaying trees. Please, God, is someone in there? Open the door! I beat my fists against the wood, shivering violently. Please! There's something in the woods! You have to let me in! A light flicked on inside the house. I heard footsteps approaching the door. I saw a shadow block the light peering through the peephole. And as I stood there on the freezing porch, begging a stranger to unlock their door and let me inside, I realized I was smiling. If you enjoyed this twist on the classic home invasion, make sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss a trip into the unknown. We have many more terrifying urban legends and true ghost stories from the dark corners of America coming soon. Don't forget to subscribe to American Haunted Tales to support the channel and keep the campfire burning. Every subscription helps us bring these forgotten nightmares to light. You have been listening to American Haunted Tales. Stay safe, stay curious, and whatever you do, never ever open the door.
Thank you for watching.